The moment my daughter-in-law, Monica, leaned across the reclaimed oak table and looked me straight in the eye, saying, "Go ahead. If you have any dignity left, you'll move to the facility by Monday. You don't fit the aesthetic here anymore." Something inside me that had been quiet for far too long finally cracked. But I didn't shout, and I didn't argue. I simply placed the heavy iron key to the estate I restored with my own hands on the counter while my son, Julian, stared at the floor, pretending not to see the humiliation burning across my face. Then I walked out into the Seattle fog without a suitcase, without a plan, and without looking back. By sunrise, the calls began. First from Julian, then from Monica, then from the security company I had personally hired. By noon, the smart home system had shut down. By evening, her credit cards were declining at the caterers. That was the moment they realized the truth. They had pushed the wrong old carpenter too far. They thought I was a relic. They thought I was weak. They thought I would crumble without their permission to exist. But what they never knew, what they never bothered to ask, was that the entire infrastructure of their comfortable little empire, every beam, every contract, every account, every privilege they tossed around like they owned the world, was standing on my name, and I had finally decided to stop carrying them. If you stay with me until the end, you will understand exactly how a quiet widower dismantled their arrogance brick by brick and reclaimed the masterpiece they thought they could steal. My name is Arthur Blackwood. I am 74 years old, a master carpenter and historic restoration expert who spent 50 years bringing the forgotten grand dames of Seattle architecture back to life. I know the difference between a load-bearing wall and a facade, just as I know the difference between honest work and a coat of cheap paint meant to hide the rot. My late wife, Eleanor, used to say that I had sawdust in my veins and that she had numbers in hers. She was a forensic accountant, the kind of woman who could look at a spreadsheet and see a story of theft or triumph in the margins. We were a good team. We built things that lasted. Or at least, I thought we had. But since Eleanor passed 3 years ago, I have learned that even the strongest timber can warp if you let too much moisture in, and in my case, the moisture had a name, Monica. The evening that broke the camel's back began deceptively quietly, the rain drumming a familiar rhythm against the leaded glass windows I had reglazed myself in 1998. I had invited Julian and Monica to move into Blackwood Manor shortly after Eleanor's funeral, believing the lie that they wanted to take care of me. For 3 years, I tried to be invisible in my own home. I restricted myself to the small guest suite on the ground floor. I stopped using the main workshop in the garage because Monica said the noise disrupted her content creation. I watched as she painted over the hand-carved mahogany wainscoting with a soulless shade of grayish because she claimed natural wood was outdated. I bit my tongue when she replaced Eleanor's antique rose garden with a gravel patio for her yoga videos. I did all of this because I love my son, and I made a promise to Eleanor to look after him. But looking after someone and being their doormat are two very different structural concepts. Dinner that night was a catered affair, sushi arranged on slate platters, because Monica didn't cook. She sat at the head of the table, my seat, or it used to be, scrolling through her phone, checking the engagement on a video where she claimed to have renovated the dining room herself. Julian sat to her right, looking tired and diminished, a man who had slowly eroded under the constant friction of his wife's ambition. I ate in silence, careful not to clink my fork against the china, having learned that any sound I made was considered an aggression. "We have a problem with the branding, Julian," Monica said, not looking up from her screen. "The followers are asking who the old man in the background of the garden reel is. It ruins the narrative of the young power couple restoring the manor. It looks messy." Julian shifted in his chair, his eyes darting to me and then quickly away. He's my dad, Monica. He lives here. Monica sighed, a long, dramatic exhalation that signaled the beginning of a lecture she had rehearsed. She finally set the phone down and turned her gaze on me. It wasn't a look of hatred, which would have been easier to bear. It was a look of appraisal, the way a contractor looks at a piece of scrap wood before tossing it into the burn pile. "Arthur," she said, using that patronizing tone she reserved for children and service workers. "We need to talk about the future. This arrangement isn't working. You're ghosting through the halls, you're cluttering the energy, and frankly, you don't fit the aesthetic we're building here. I've found a lovely facility in Tacoma. Assisted living. It's vibrant. You'll leave Monday." The silence that followed was heavy, thick with the smell of rain and expensive raw fish. I looked at Julian, waiting. I waited for the boy I had taught to hold a hammer, the man I had put through engineering school, to speak up. I waited for him to say, "No, this is his house." I waited for him to defend the father who had paid off his student loans and bought him his first car. But Julian just picked at his sashimi, his shoulders hunched, his spine completely dissolved. "It might be better, Dad," he mumbled, his voice barely audible over the rain. "Monica says it's really high-end. They have a wood shop there. A hobby shop. A hobby shop." The insult landed like a sledgehammer to the chest. I have restored landmarks. I have rebuilt the staircases of the governor's mansion. I have forgotten more about structure than this boy would ever know, and he was relegating me to a hobby shop to glue popsicle sticks together while his wife turned my life's work into a backdrop for her internet vanity. That was the moment the crack happened. It wasn't a loud break, it was the quiet snap of a tension cable finally giving way. I wiped my mouth with the linen napkin, folded it neatly, and placed it on the table. "If you are so brave," she had said, "just leave." And so I did. I stood up, my knees protesting slightly in the damp weather, but my back straighter than it had been in years. I reached into the pocket of my flannel shirt and pulled out the master key. It was a heavy thing, iron skeleton style, which I had forged myself to fit the original 1920s lock mechanisms I had restored on the front door. I placed it gently on the oak table. The sound of metal hitting would echoed in the silent room. Clink. It sounded like a judge's gavel. "Arthur, don't be dramatic," Monica scoffed, picking up her wine glass. "Where are you going to go?" "The shack in the woods. It doesn't even have Wi-Fi." I didn't answer. I didn't look at her. I looked at my son one last time, memorizing the face of the man who had just sold me out for a quiet life. "Goodbye, Julian," I said softly. He didn't look up. I turned and walked to the foyer, putting on my waxed canvas coat and my cap. As I opened the heavy front door, the wind swept in, smelling of pine needles and wet pavement. It smelled like freedom. I walked out to my truck, a 1978 Ford F-150 that I kept in pristine condition. It was parked next to their leased white Range Rover. The truck started with a reliable roar, a machine built in an era when things were made to last. As I backed out of the driveway, I saw Monica standing in the window, watching me, a glass of wine in her hand. She looked triumphant. She thought she had won. She thought she had just cleared the final obstacle to her perfect life. She had no idea that she had just severed the main power line to her entire existence. I drove through the winding roads of the property, the headlights cutting through the thick coastal fog. I didn't head to a hotel. I didn't head to Tacoma. I drove 2 miles up the ridge to the parcel of land I had never added to the main deed, the parcel where the shack stood. Monica called it a shack because she had never stepped foot inside. To her, it was an eyesore. To me, it was the barn. A converted, insulated, structurally reinforced workshop with a loft, a wood stove, and a generator. It was where I did my real work. And it was where Eleanor had told me to go if this day ever came. I parked the truck and unlocked the barn door. The air inside was warm and smelled of cedar shavings and linseed oil. It was the smell of home. I flipped the switch, and the industrial lights hummed to life, illuminating my tools hanging in perfect order on the pegboard, chisels, saws, planes, waiting for my hands. I walked to the back of the shop, past the lathe, to the heavy steel safe bolted to the concrete floor beneath the lumber rack. My hands were steady as I dialed the combination, Eleanor's birthday. The heavy door swung open. Inside, sitting on top of a stack of deeds and bonds, was a leather-bound book with a red spine. The Red Ledger. Eleanor had handed it to me 3 days before she died, her hands frail but her eyes sharp as tacks. "Arthur," she had whispered, "you have a blind spot for family. You always have. Promise me you won't open this unless they try to push you out. But if they do, burn it all down." I took the book out and set it on my workbench. Outside, the rain intensified, hammering against the metal roof. I was alone. I was 74 years old, and for the first time in 3 years, I was the one holding the hammer. I woke to the sound of rain hitting the metal roof of the barn, a sharp, industrial staccato that was entirely different from the muffled silence of the manor's triple-paned glass. For the first time in 3 years, I didn't wake up feeling like an intruder in my own life. I swung my legs out of the cot in the loft, my feet finding the rough-hewn pine floorboards I had milled myself 20 years ago. The air here was cold, biting with the dampness of the Pacific Northwest, but it was honest air. It didn't smell of Monica's cloying lavender diffusers or the chemical tang of the cleaning products she insisted on using because the bottle design matched her color palette. I walked down the metal spiral staircase to the main workshop floor, brewed a pot of coffee on the cast-iron wood stove, and sat at my workbench. The Red Ledger sat there, a silent sentinel, but I didn't open it yet. First, I had to disconnect the utilities of the life I had just left behind. They always assumed the smart home system in the manor ran on magic, or perhaps on the sheer force of Monica's willpower. They didn't understand that I had designed the integrated circuit myself, wiring the entire estate to a central server that lived not in the house, but here, in the reinforced server cabinet of my workshop. Eleanor had insisted on it. "Centralized control, Arthur," she had said, tapping a blueprint with her pen. "If the main house is ever compromised, the command center survives." I hadn't understood what she meant by compromised back then, thinking she worried about earthquakes or power grid failures. Now, looking at the blinking green lights on the server rack, I realized she was talking about an infestation of a different kind. I logged into the terminal, my fingers moving over the mechanical keyboard with the muscle memory of a man who knows his own creation. I didn't do it with malice. I did it with the precision of a surgeon removing a tumor. First, I disabled the remote access to the thermostat. The radiant heating system, a complex network of hydronic tubes beneath the imported Italian tile Monica loved so much, required a constant signal to maintain temperature. I cut the signal. Next, I severed the internet gateway. The fiber optic line ran through a junction box on the edge of the property, a box I controlled. Finally, I logged into the family banking portal, the one they thought was joint, but which was actually a sub-account of my primary holdings, and flagged the credit cards as lost or stolen. I didn't cancel them. Cancellation implies a permanent end. Marking them as stolen simply froze them instantly, a temporary measure that would cause maximum confusion. I took a sip of my coffee. It was black, strong, and bitter. It tasted like reality. By 8 a.m., the chaos at the manor had begun, though I only witnessed it through the data streams on my monitor. The panic protocol on the home security dashboard triggered, alerting me that someone was frantically trying to reboot the main panel in the hallway. I imagined Monica standing there in her silk robe, shivering as the residual heat leached out of the floorboards, jabbing her manicured finger at a touchscreen that refused to acknowledge her existence. The temperature in the main house had already dropped 4 degrees. The heated towel racks would be stone cold. The espresso machine, which required a Wi-Fi connection to download its brewing profiles, would be nothing more than an expensive paperweight. They were discovering, minute by minute, that their comfort was not a natural right, but a service I had been quietly providing. I learned the details later from Lily, who texted me from school using her own data plan, having realized the Wi-Fi was dead. "Mom is losing it," she wrote. She tried to upload at the morning routine story and the upload failed. She's screaming at Dad to call the provider. Dad is on hold. The house is freezing. "Are you okay, Grandpa?" I texted back a simple thumbs up. I wasn't just okay, I was finally calibrated. I spent the morning sharpening my chisels, the rhythmic SDHSH of the steel against the whetstone calming my mind. I was preparing. Construction requires a clear sight, and I was currently in the demolition phase. Around noon, the first real crack in their facade appeared. I received the notification on my phone from the credit card company. Transaction declined, $4,500, Elite Catering and Events. Monica was trying to book the housewarming party she had threatened me with, the party meant to celebrate my departure. She was trying to spend my money to celebrate kicking me out of my own home. I watched the notification blink and fade. A second attempt came through 2 minutes later. Transaction declined. Then a third. She was frantic now, likely standing in the kitchen, her voice rising an octave with every rejection, blaming the glitch on the bank, on the caterer, on anyone but herself. She had never considered that the plastic card in her wallet was connected to a reservoir she didn't own. The phone call from Julian came at 12:15 p.m. I let it ring twice before answering, putting it on speaker so I could continue oiling the handle of my Japanese saw. "Dad?" His voice was tight, high-pitched, the voice of a man who is trying to sound authoritative but is actually terrified. "Dad, something is wrong with the accounts. Monica is trying to pay the vendors for next week, and the cards aren't working. And the internet is down. The whole house it's malfunctioning." "It's not malfunctioning, Julian," I said, my voice steady, absorbing the echo of the large wooden barn. "It's disconnected." "What? What do you mean disconnected? Did you forget to pay the bill?" The accusation was so automatic, so reflexive. Even now, he assumed I was the one who had failed. He assumed the old man had forgotten, had slipped, had let the ball drop. He couldn't conceive of a world where I had simply decided to stop playing catch. "I didn't forget anything," I replied, running my thumb along the edge of the blade to test its sharpness. "I canceled the service. The internet, the heating maintenance contract, the household expense account. They were all in my name, paid for by my pension and the dividends from the company I sold. Since I no longer live there, I see no reason to pay for the utilities of a boarding house I've been evicted from." There was a silence on the other end so profound I could almost hear the gears in his mind grinding against the rust of his complacency. "But, Dad, we can't live like this. It's freezing. Monica has a deadline. We need those cards. That's our money. Is it? I asked. The question hung in the air, heavy and immovable. You might want to check the paperwork, son. The paperwork you never bothered to read when you moved in. The household operations account was a discretionary fund provided by the owner, me, for the maintenance of the property. It is not an allowance. It is not a salary. And it is certainly not a severance package. Monica is going to call the police, Julian stammered, his defense crumbling into desperation. She says this is financial abuse. She says you're holding us hostage. I am not holding you hostage, Julian. You are free to leave. You are free to pay for your own internet, your own heat, and your own catering. I am simply closing the ledger on my expenses. I paused, looking at the red ledger on the workbench. Speaking of ledgers, I suggest you ask your wife about the withdrawal she made 3 weeks ago from the emergency repair fund. The $3,000 labeled roof maintenance that went to a handbag designer in Milan. I'm looking at the receipt right now. I heard a gasp in the background, faint but distinct. Monica was listening. She had been hovering over his shoulder, feeding him lines, and now she had gone silent. I have work to do, Julian, I said. Don't call again unless you're ready to apologize. And tell Monica that the heater requires a specific glycol mixture. If she tries to fill it with water, she'll burst the pipes and destroy the foundation. Though I suppose she knows all about destroying foundations. I ended the call. My hand was shaking slightly, not from fear, but from the adrenaline of finally saying the words I had swallowed for 3 years. I looked at the red ledger. The leather was cool to the touch. Eleanor had been a forensic accountant, but she was also a wife who had watched a woman slowly dismantle her husband's dignity. She had seen the numbers, yes, but she had also seen the soul of the thief. I opened the book to the first page. It wasn't just bank statements. It was a timeline. It was a map of deception that went back far longer than I had ever imagined. The red ledger was heavy, bound in the kind of crimson leather that is meant to last a century, the sort of book a ship's captain might use to record storms and mutinies. I sat there for a long time just holding it, listening to the rain hammer against the corrugated metal roof of the barn. My hands, calloused from 50 years of handling rough-sawn timber and cold steel, trembled slightly. It wasn't fear. It was the crushing weight of realization that my wife, my gentle, brilliant Eleanor, had spent her final days not resting, but working. While the cancer was stealing her strength, she was quietly building a fortress around me, brick by forensic brick, because she knew I was too trusting to see the wolves circling the gate. I opened the cover. On the flyleaf, in Eleanor's precise, angular script, was a single inscription, for Arthur. Because you build with your heart, but sometimes you need to fight with your head. Don't look away. I took a breath that tasted of cedar dust and turned the page. What I found was not merely a list of transactions. It was an autopsy of a deception. Eleanor had treated Monica's entry into our lives like a structural failure analysis. She had tracked every movement, every dollar, every inconsistency from the moment Julian introduced her to us 5 years ago. I remembered that day. Monica had been charming, dressed in modest cashmere, talking about her family's estate in Connecticut and her passion for ethical design. She had flattered Eleanor, praised my restoration work, and looked at Julian with adoring eyes. I had seen a daughter-in-law. Eleanor, it turned out, had seen a discrepancy. The first section of the ledger was titled The Infiltration Phase. It detailed small withdrawals from Julian's accounts, dinners, emergency, car repairs, gifts. Nothing alarming on the surface, but Eleanor had annotated them in red ink. November 12th, charity gala ticket, $500. Event does not exist. Money transferred to an account in Henderson, Nevada. December 4th, vintage restoration consultation, $1,200. Consultant is a Shell LLC registered to a P.O. box in Las Vegas. I traced the lines with my finger, feeling the sickness rise in my throat. Monica hadn't been spending money on luxury, she had been funneling it. She was siphoning liquidity out of Julian's life before they were even married. The second section, marked the consolidation, covered the year after they moved into the manor. This was when the numbers became staggering. I had given Julian access to the household accounts to manage the property, thinking I was teaching him responsibility. I saw now that I had handed a loaded gun to a bank robber. The renovations Monica insisted on, the ones she claimed were necessary to modernize the estate, were a sham. Invoice, $15,000 for Carrara marble sourcing. Eleanor's note below it was scathing. Stone is standard grade, purchased from a local depot for $3,200. Difference of $11,800 unaccounted for. I flipped the pages faster now, the image of Monica's smug face burning in my mind. She had stood in my kitchen, eating the food I paid for, living in the warmth I provided, all while systematically stripping the copper from the walls. She had complained about my clutter while she stole my legacy. But it was the third section that stopped me cold. It was a dossier, complete with photocopies of public records that Eleanor must have paid a private investigator to retrieve. It was titled The Origin. Monica had always told us she was a St. James from the Connecticut coast. She claimed her parents were old money philanthropists who were too busy traveling to attend the wedding. I looked at the birth certificate pasted onto the page. Name, Monica Carla Venn. Place of birth, Reno, Nevada. Father, Frank Venn, blackjack dealer, deceased. Mother, Gloria Venn, unemployed. There were police reports attached. A shoplifting charge in 2008. A credit card fraud investigation in 2012 that was dismissed for lack of evidence. And then, a civil suit from 2015 involving an elderly man in Arizona named George Halloway. The summary was brief but damning. Plaintiff alleges Ms. Venn coerced him into signing over power of attorney during a period of medical incapacity. Settled out of court. I closed my eyes, the rage settling into a cold, hard knot in my stomach. It wasn't just greed. It was a pattern. She was a professional. She had targeted Julian not because she loved him, but because he was the weak link in a chain that led to Blackwood Manor. She had researched us. She knew the value of the property, the size of my pension, the nature of my assets. She had played the role of the devoted partner perfectly, waiting for the right moment to push the old man out and claim the prize. But she had made two fatal miscalculations. First, she assumed that because I was quiet, I was stupid. And second, she underestimated Eleanor. My wife had seen the rot in the timber before the house was even framed. She had compiled this evidence while she was dying, fighting through pain and exhaustion to ensure that I would have a weapon when the war finally started. I turned to the final page of the ledger. It wasn't a spreadsheet. It was a letter, written in shaky handwriting that told me it was composed near the very end. Arthur, if you are reading this, she has made her move. I suspect she will try to isolate you first. She will call you a burden. She will try to make you feel small in the house you built. Don't listen to her. Listen to the numbers. I have set up the trust in a way she cannot touch, but you have to be the one to pull the trigger. The deed is not lost, Arthur. It is not in the safe deposit box where Julian thinks it is. I moved it. It is in the false bottom of your grandfather's tool chest in the attic. You need to get it before she tears the house apart looking for it. Use this book. Destroy her lies with the truth. I love you. Build something beautiful from the wreckage. I sat in the silence of the barn, tears streaming down my face, soaking into my beard. I wept for the woman who had loved me enough to protect me from beyond the grave. I wept for the son I had lost to a grifter's charm. And then, I wiped my face with my sleeve and stood up. The grief was still there, but it had hardened into something useful. It had become structural steel. I walked over to the server rack and checked the monitors. The temperature in the main house had dropped to 58 degrees. The system showed that someone, Julian, likely, was trying to force a reboot of the boiler, but without the admin code, he was just pressing dead buttons. I looked at the camera feed from the driveway. A white van from a heating repair company was pulling up to the gate. The driver pressed the intercom button. Nothing happened. I had cut power to the gate 3 hours ago. Monica stormed out of the front door, wrapped in a designer coat that I now knew was purchased with stolen money. She was screaming at the driver through the iron bars, gesturing wildly. She looked small. She looked desperate. She looked like exactly what she was, a con artist whose luck had just run out. I reached for the phone. I needed to call Marcus Thorne, the attorney Eleanor had instructed me to use. He was a shark, a man I had always avoided because I preferred a handshake to a contract. But today, I didn't need a carpenter. I needed a demolition expert. "Hello, Marcus," I said when he answered. "My name is Arthur Blackwood. Eleanor told me to call you when the rain started." "Well, it's pouring." Marcus Thorne's office was not what I expected. I had anticipated mahogany and leather, the traditional trappings of a man who charged $600 an hour. Instead, his workspace was glass and steel, suspended high above the gray Seattle skyline, looking down on the city like a watchtower. Thorne himself matched the room, sharp, efficient, and utterly devoid of warmth. He read the red ledger in silence, his eyes scanning the pages with the predatory focus of a shark sensing blood in the water. When he finally looked up, he didn't smile. He simply nodded. "Your wife was a terrifying woman, Mr. Blackwood," he said. "I would have liked her." "She was thorough," I replied, watching the rain streak the floor-to-ceiling windows. "She knew that a house is only as strong as its paperwork." "Indeed." Thorne tapped a manicured finger on the document he had just drafted. "While you were driving here, my associates confirmed the status of the deed. Your daughter-in-law is currently learning a very expensive lesson in property law. You see, grifters like Monica, or Carla, as the state of Nevada knew her, operate on the assumption of possession. They move in, they change the locks, they create a narrative of ownership. But they rarely check the foundation." Thorne was right. While I sat in his climate-controlled office, the situation at Blackwood Manor was devolving into panicked improvisation. I learned the details later from Lily, who had retreated to her bedroom with a space heater and her laptop, documenting the collapse of her mother's empire with the detached precision of a war correspondent. Monica, realizing that her credit cards were frozen and the utilities were severed, had come to the only conclusion her parasitic mind could process: liquidate the host. If she couldn't live off the dividends, she would sell the asset. "We sell the house," Monica had screamed, pacing the freezing living room in her UGG boots and a fur coat. "We sell it today. We listed for $2 million cash, fast close. We take the money and move to LA, I am not freezing to death in this Gothic nightmare. Julian, shivering in a sweater I had knitted him 10 years ago, tried to reason with her. Monica, we can't just sell. Dad might have paperwork. Dad is gone, she shrieked. He walked out. That's abandonment. Possession is 9/10 of the law, Julian. Get the file. Get the deed. We are calling the realtor. Julian, broken by the cold and his wife's relentless pressure, went to the heavy oak filing cabinet in the study. This was the cabinet where I kept the manuals for the boiler, the warranties for the roof, and what they believed were the ownership documents. He pulled out the thick file labeled property records. Monica snatched it from his hands, her eyes wide with greed, already spending the commission in her head. She tore it open, dumping the contents onto the desk. She found the original survey maps from 1924. She found the restoration permits I had filed in 1998. She found the insurance policies. But she did not find a deed with Julian's name on it. Instead, she found a blue binder with a single, embossed title, the Eleanor Blackwood Heritage Trust. "What is this?" she demanded, flipping the cover open. "What is a heritage trust?" I don't know," Julian stammered. "Mom handled the estate planning. She said it was for tax purposes. She said it protected us." "It protects the house," I said to Thorne, back in the glass office. "Eleanor explained it to me. The trust owns the property. I am the sole trustee. Julian is a beneficiary only in the event of my death, and even then, there are stipulations." Thorne smiled, a thin, razor-like expression. "The guest clause. It's my favorite part of the document. Page 14, paragraph 3. Back at the manor, Monica had found page 14. Her finger traced the legal jargon, her face paling as the words began to sink in. The individuals known as Julian Blackwood and Monica Blackwood are hereby granted a revocable license of occupancy. This license classifies said individuals as guests, not tenants. They hold no equity, no title, and no claim to the property located at 4400 Pine Ridge Road. This license is contingent upon the maintenance of the property standards and the goodwill of the trustee. Guests. Monica whispered, the word tasting like ash in her mouth. Guests. Keep reading, Julian said, his voice trembling. He was looking at the paragraph below it. The trustee reserves the right to revoke this license at any time, for any reason, with or without cause. Upon revocation, the guests shall have 7 days to vacate the premises. Failure to vacate will constitute trespassing. Monica threw the binder across the room. It hit the wall with a dull thud, sliding down to the floor amidst the debris of her shattered expectations. He tricked us, she screamed, her voice cracking. That old man and his witch of a wife tricked us. We've been living here for 3 years, Julian. I put my soul into this house. I chose the paint. I chose the curtains. You chose the paint, Julian muttered, staring at the empty space on the desk where the deed should have been. But you didn't pay for the walls. This is illegal, she yelled, grabbing her phone. I'm calling the lawyer. I'm suing for adverse possession. I'm suing for emotional distress. He can't just throw us out into the street. Actually, Thorne said, sliding a single sheet of cream-colored paper across the desk to me, we can. And we will. This is the notice to vacate. I've taken the liberty of citing the specific violations of the trust agreement, namely, the attempted unauthorized sale of the asset and the structural damage caused by negligence. I'm referring to the vigrage, paint over the mahogany, by the way. That is a crime against architecture. I took the pen. The weight of it felt good in my hand. For 3 years, I had signed checks to cover their mistakes. I had signed permits for renovations I hated. I had signed birthday cards for a woman who despised me. Now, I was signing the only document that mattered. I wrote Arthur Blackwood in the steady, block lettering of a draftsman. "We will have this delivered by courier within the hour," Thorne said, retrieving the paper. "But there is one more thing, Arthur. The red ledger mentions a contact named Viper. Do you know who that is?" "No," I admitted. Eleanor tracked the payments, but she couldn't identify the recipient. Thorne leaned back in his chair, tenting his fingers. My investigator ran the number associated with the text messages Lily intercepted. Viper isn't a person. It's a handle for a fence in Las Vegas. A man who specializes in liquidating high-value assets without questions, jewelry, art, antiques. My stomach turned. She wasn't just planning to sell the house. "No," Thorne said quietly. "She was planning to strip it first. The Tiffany lamps, the sterling silver, your grandfather's tools. She needed liquid cash, fast. And she was going to get your legacy to get it." I stood up, walking to the window. Below me, the city was gray and relentless, a grid of concrete and steel. But in my mind, I saw the manor. I saw the hand-carved newel post I had sanded for 3 weeks. I saw the stained glass transom I had repaired piece by piece. I saw the home Eleanor and I had built, not just with wood and stone, but with years of shared silence and understanding. Monica saw it as a bank account. I saw it as a living thing. "Send the letter, Marcus," I said, my voice hard. "And add a postscript. Tell them that I have scheduled a rigorous inventory inspection for tomorrow morning at 9 a.m. If a single teaspoon is missing, I will press criminal charges." Thorne nodded. "And if they refuse to open the door?" I reached into my pocket and touched the cold iron of the master key, feeling the teeth that I had filed myself. "They don't have to open the door," I said. I never gave them the keys to the locks that actually matter. The rain had settled into a steady, rhythmic drumming against the metal roof of the barn, the kind of sound that usually lulled me into a meditative state while I worked. But tonight, there was no peace in the rhythm. I sat at my workbench, the red ledger open before me, cross-referencing Eleanor's handwritten notes with the digital files Marcus Thorne had sent over. The scope of Monica's, or rather, Carla Venn's, deception was vast, a sprawling architecture of lies that went far beyond simple greed. She hadn't just wanted my money, she had wanted to erase me. She viewed my history, my home, and my very presence as obstacles to be demolished so she could build her own shallow empire on the lot. I was so engrossed in the forensic accounting of my own life that I almost missed the soft knock at the heavy sliding door. It wasn't the frantic pounding of a desperate woman or the hesitant tapping of a guilty son. It was a rhythmic, code-like rap, tap tap, pause, tap. It was the signal Eleanor used to use when she brought me coffee late at night, a sound from a ghost. I froze, my hand hovering over the ledger. Then the pattern repeated. I stood up, my knees protesting the damp cold, and walked to the small side door. When I opened it, the wind whipped rain into my face, but I didn't feel the chill. Standing there, wrapped in a dark oversized hoodie with her backpack clutched to her chest, was Lily. My granddaughter looked like a refugee from a war I hadn't realized was being fought on 2 fronts. Her hair was plastered to her forehead, and her glasses were fogged up, but her expression was eerily calm. She didn't say a word. She just stepped inside, shaking off the water like a stray cat seeking warmth. I closed the door and locked it, then immediately went to the wood stove to pour a cup of hot cocoa from the pot I kept warm. "They don't know I'm here," she said, her voice small but steady in the cavernous space. "Mom is in the master bedroom screaming at a lawyer in New York. Dad is in the kitchen drinking scotch and staring at the wall. The house feels dead, Grandpa. It feels like the power went out, even though the emergency lights are on." I handed her the mug, watching her wrap her cold fingers around the ceramic. Lily was 17, quiet, brilliant, and often overlooked by her parents because she didn't fit Monica's brand of outgoing perfection. She preferred code to content creation, silence to performance. In that way, she was entirely Blackwood. "You shouldn't be out in this storm, Lily Bug," I said gently, using the nickname I hadn't spoken in years. "It's not safe." "It's safer here than there," she replied, taking a sip. She looked around the workshop, her eyes landing on the server rack, the red ledger, and the blueprints spread out on the table. She didn't look surprised. She looked relieved. "Grandma told me you'd have a plan. She said that if things ever got bad, I should come to the barn. She said you build things to last, but you also know how to take them apart." She set the mug down on the workbench and unzipped her backpack. From a hidden inner pocket, she pulled out a silver flash drive. It was small, unassuming, but she held it with the reverence of someone handling a loaded weapon. "Mon thinks she's smart because she changed her passwords when you left," Lily said, a faint, dry smile touching her lips. "She thinks because she kicked you off the Wi-Fi, she's secure. But she forgot who set up the network. She forgot that you taught me how to mirror the cloud traffic before I was 12. I looked at the drive, then at my granddaughter. I had spent so much time worrying about protecting her that I hadn't realized she had been protecting herself. "What is this, Lily?" "It's everything," she said. "Text messages, deleted emails, location history. I've been backing up the family cloud to a private server for 6 months. Ever since I heard her talking to someone on the phone late at night when Dad was asleep. She wasn't talking about renovations, Grandpa. She was talking about liquidation." I plugged the drive into my terminal. The screen flickered to life, filling with folders organized by date and media type. Lily leaned over my shoulder, her presence a comforting weight, and navigated to a folder labeled Messages, External. "Look at this thread," she pointed. "The contact is saved as Interior Designer, but the area code is Nevada. And the language, it's not about fabric swatches." I opened the file. The timestamps were recent, some from just days before the eviction dinner, others from the very night I left. The contact on the other end was labeled simply as Viper. "Monica, the old timberhead is finally gone. He actually walked out. I didn't even have to call the cops. Viper, good. Timeline. Monica, aggressive. Give me 2 weeks to liquidate the antique furniture. The Tiffany lamps, the silver service, the grand piano. I need cash to cover the staging costs before we list the property. Viper, what about the husband? Monica, Julian? He's a non-factor. He'll sign whatever I put in front of him. Just get the truck ready. I want the house gutted by the 15th. The words burned into the screen, glowing with a toxic green hue. Timberhead. The insult didn't hurt, it was the dismissal that stung. She saw me as nothing more than a dense block of wood, something to be stepped over or burned. But the second part of the message made my blood run cold. Liquidate. She wasn't just planning to sell the house, she was planning to strip it. The piano she mentioned was a 1928 Steinway that Eleanor had played every Sunday for 40 years. The silver was a wedding gift from my parents. These weren't assets to Monica, they were just loot. "There's more," Lily said, her voice dropping to a whisper. She clicked on a separate folder labeled audio. She accidentally recorded a voice memo 3 weeks ago. I think she meant to send it, but she saved it instead. She pressed play. Monica's voice filled the barn, tinny but unmistakable, stripped of the polished influencer cadence she used for the world. "Mom, stop worrying. The plan is working. Julian is completely malleable. The old man is checking out. Once we get power of attorney, we dump him in a home and sell the estate. I'm looking at $3 million, easy. We'll be back in Vegas by Christmas. Just tell Frank to keep the tables warm." The recording ended with the sharp click of a phone locking. Silence rushed back into the workshop, heavy and suffocating. I stared at the waveform on the screen, a jagged visual representation of the betrayal that had been living under my roof. Julian wasn't just a victim of a bad marriage, he was the mark in a long con. And Lily, my poor, brilliant granddaughter, had been living in the belly of the beast, documenting the digestion of her own family. "Does your father know?" I asked quietly. Lily shook her head, tears finally spilling over behind her glasses. "I couldn't tell him. He wouldn't believe me. She has him so twisted up, Grandpa. He thinks she's the victim. He thinks you abandoned us. If I showed him this, he'd just tell her, and she'd." I didn't know what she would do. I turned on my stool and pulled Lily into a hug. She buried her face in my flannel shirt, sobbing the way she used to when she scraped her knee as a child. I held her tight, feeling the fierce protective instinct that had driven me to build this entire life in the first place. Eleanor was right. We had built a fortress, but we had let the enemy in through the front door. Now, it was time to close the gates. "You did the right thing, Lily," I whispered into her hair. "You did exactly what your grandmother would have wanted. You were the watchman." I looked over her shoulder at the red ledger and the glowing screen. I had the financial records. I had the legal leverage from Marcus Thorne. And now, thanks to the spy in the attic, I had the smoking gun. Monica wanted a war. She wanted to liquidate my legacy. She was about to discover that when you strike a match in a room full of sawdust, you don't get a controlled burn. You get an explosion. "Stay here tonight," I told Lily, pulling away and wiping her tears with my thumb. "The loft has clean sheets. It's worn. Tomorrow morning, I have an appointment at the manor. Marcus Thorne calls it an inventory inspection." I looked at the screen one last time, my eyes fixing on the name Viper. "I call it an eviction." The morning after Lily arrived, the rain finally broke, leaving behind a sky the color of bruised steel and a silence that felt heavy with anticipation. We spent the early hours in the barn, establishing a rhythm that felt natural, almost hereditary. While I worked on the fingerboard of the violin, a commission for a concertmaster in Vancouver that I had been delaying for months, Lily sat at the small drafting table I had set up for her, coding on her laptop. She didn't speak much, and neither did I. We were two people who understood that noise was often a cover for emptiness, and we had no need for cover here. The violin was a test of steadiness. To carve the ebony, one needs a hand that does not shake and a mind that does not wander. Monica had told everyone who would listen that my hands were trembling, that my mind was slipping, that I was a danger to myself and the structural integrity of the manor. It was a narrative she had been building for years, a slow drip of poison meant to erode my credibility so that when she finally made her move, no one would believe the confused old man. She had underestimated the fact that my confusion was a choice, a politeness I offered to avoid conflict. Now that the conflict was here, the fog had lifted completely. At 10 a.m., a blue sedan with government plates pulled up the gravel drive, navigating the potholes with cautious distaste. I watched through the window as a woman in a beige raincoat stepped out, clutching a clipboard against her chest like a shield. She looked at the barn, then at the main house in the distance, then checked a file in her hand. She didn't look like an enemy. She looked like a bureaucrat, overworked and underpaid, sent to clean up a mess someone else had made. "Stay here, Lily," I said, wiping the ebony dust from my hands with a rag. "And keep that flash drive hidden." I met the woman at the door before she could knock. "Mr. Blackwood?" she asked, her eyes scanning me for signs of dementia, disheveled clothes, mismatched shoes, the vacant stare of the lost. Instead, she found a man in a pressed flannel shirt and canvas apron, smelling of fresh coffee and expensive wood. "I am Arthur Blackwood," I said, opening the door wide to let the warmth of the workshop spill out into the damp air. "Please, come in. The damp is bad for the joints." She stepped inside, blinking as her eyes adjusted to the bright, industrial lighting. She looked around, expecting, I assume, the squalor Monica had described in her report. Instead, she saw a workshop that was cleaner than most operating rooms. Tools hung in precise size order on the walls. The floor was swept clean. The air filtration system hummed quietly in the corner. And in the center of the room, the violin sat in a cradle, a masterpiece of maple and spruce waiting to sing. "I'm Sarah Jenkins," she said, her voice losing some of its official edge as she took in the surroundings. "I'm with Adult Protective Services. We received a call, actually, several calls, regarding your welfare." "I imagined you might," I said, gesturing to the stool near the wood stove. "Please, sit. Would you like coffee? It's fresh." She sat down, looking confused. "Mr. Blackwood, the report stated that you were living in a dilapidated shack without heat or running water. It claimed you were suffering from severe cognitive decline, aggressive outbursts, and hallucinations. The reporting party, your daughter-in-law, stated that you were a danger to yourself and others." I poured her a cup of coffee and placed it gently on the workbench. "My daughter-in-law has a vivid imagination, Ms. Jenkins. As you can see, the shack is a fully insulated, climate-controlled workspace. I have heat, I have water, and I have a generator. As for my cognitive state," I picked up the caliper from my bench. "I am currently carving a violin bridge to a tolerance of 0.05 millimeters. If my hands were shaking or my mind was wandering, that piece of wood would be scrap." Sarah Jenkins took a sip of coffee, her eyes moving to Lily, who was watching from the loft railing. "And the young woman?" "My granddaughter, Lily," I said. "She is visiting. She prefers the quiet here to the chaos at the main house." Sarah opened her file, clicking her pen. "The report claims you were evicted from the main residence because you became violent at dinner. It says you threatened your family with a weapon." "I threatened them with a key," I corrected calmly. "I placed my house key on the table and left because I was told I was no longer welcome in the home I own. I didn't shout. I didn't strike anyone. I simply removed myself from a hostile environment." I paused, looking her in the eye. "Ms. Jenkins, do you know what a false flag is in naval terms? It is a feint designed to hide the true aggressor." I walked over to the safe and retrieved the red ledger, not the whole book, but a folder Marcus Thorne had prepared for me, anticipating exactly this move. I slid it across the workbench. Monica Blackwood, or Carla Venn, as she was known in Nevada, didn't call you because she is worried about my health, I said. She called you because yesterday, I cut off her access to my bank accounts. She called you because she is trying to establish a paper trail of incompetence so she can petition for power of attorney. She wants control of my assets, Miss Jenkins. And she is using your agency as a weapon to get it. Sarah Jenkins was silent for a long moment. She opened the folder. She saw the trust documents. She saw the evidence of the frozen credit cards. She saw the restraining order Marcus Thorne was currently drafting. She read the timeline of events, seeing the clear correlation between the money being cut off and the sudden concern for my well-being. "This is extensive," she murmured. "My late wife was a forensic accountant," I said. "We believe in documentation." Sarah closed the folder and looked at me, really looked at me, stripping away the age and the gray beard to see the man underneath. "Mr. Blackwood, I've been doing this job for 15 years. I know what a confused old man looks like. And I know what a grifter looks like." She stood up, tucking her clipboard under her arm. "I'm going to close this case as unfounded. The living conditions are superior, the subject is lucid and oriented, and there is no evidence of self-neglect." "Thank you," I said. "However," she added, her voice dropping to a professional whisper, "based on what I see here, the financial exploitation, I could open a different kind of file. If you want to press charges for elder abuse regarding the misappropriation of funds." "Not yet," I said, thinking of Julian. "I have a mediation scheduled. I want to give them one last chance to do the right thing. But keep that file ready, Ms. Jenkins." She nodded and walked to the door. Before she left, she turned back to look at the violin. "It's beautiful," she said. "Does it play?" "Not yet," I answered. "It needs tension to make music. We're just applying the tension now." As her car disappeared down the driveway, I felt a heavy weight lift from my shoulders. Monica had played her ace. She had tried to have the state declare me invalid, to strip me of my agency so she could legally plunder what was left. And in doing so, she had exposed her own desperation. She was flailing, striking out blindly because the walls were closing in. "She's going to be so mad," Lily said from the loft, her voice trembling slightly. "Let her be mad," I said, returning to my bench and picking up the chisel. "Anger makes people sloppy. And sloppy people make mistakes." I didn't know then how right I was. Monica's rage at the failed APS visit would drive her to make the final, fatal error that Eleanor had predicted 3 years ago. She wouldn't just try to sell the house now. She would try to destroy it. And she had no idea that I had already invited the demolition crew. The violin was finished. It sat on the velvet-lined workbench, the varnish catching the harsh industrial light of the barn, glowing with the deep, rich amber of aged maple. I had spent the last 24 hours applying the final coat, working in a silence that was broken only by the hum of the dehumidifier and the rapid clicking of Lily's keyboard from the loft. To build a violin is an exercise in controlled tension. The wood must be shaped to resist the pull of the strings, yet flexible enough to vibrate. If it is too rigid, it has no soul. If it is too weak, it collapses. I ran my thumb along the scroll, feeling the perfect symmetry of the curve. My family was no different. We had been under immense tension for years, and now we were about to see who would sing and who would snap. Marcus Thorne called at 2 p.m. His voice was as crisp as the tailored suits he wore, cutting through the static of the speakerphone. "The trap is set, Arthur," he said. I contacted Monica's attorney, a court-appointed mediator she hired online, and proposed a settlement meeting. I told them you were exhausted and ready to discuss terms of transition. They took the bait immediately. "She thinks I'm surrendering," I said, wiping a speck of dust from the instrument. "She thinks you're broken," Thorne corrected. "Narcissists always mistake silence for submission." "She believes the eviction notice was a bluff, a desperate flail from a drowning man. She's convinced that if she gets you in a room, she can bully you into signing the deed over to keep the peace. She doesn't know about the red ledger. She doesn't know about the Nevada records. And she certainly doesn't know about the recordings Lily found." "When?" I asked. "Tomorrow morning. 10 a.m. The dining room of the manor. I'll bring the paperwork. You just bring the truth." I hung up and looked up at the loft. Lily was peering over the railing, her face pale but determined. "She's texting Viper again," she said, holding up her phone. "She told him to bring the truck tomorrow afternoon. She said, the old man is folding. I'll have the keys by noon. Be ready to load the silver." I felt a flash of anger, hot and sharp, but I tamped it down. Anger is a poor fuel for precision work. "Let her plan," I said. "Let her believe the road is clear. It makes the crash that much more definitive." That night, I didn't sleep. Instead, I sat by the wood stove, watching the flames lick at the seasoned oak logs, and thought about foundations. In construction, there is a phenomenon known as dry rot. It is insidious because it often hides behind a coat of fresh paint or a layer of healthy-looking wood. It eats the cellulose from the inside out, turning structural beams into dust while leaving the surface appearing intact. You can't sand away dry rot. You can't patch it. You have to cut it out completely, even if it means removing parts of the house you love. Julian was my son. I had held him when he was hours old, his fingers curling around my thumb with a grip that felt like a promise. I had taught him to ride a bike, to drive a car, to read a blueprint. But somewhere along the way, the rot had set in. Maybe I had been too soft. Maybe I had sheltered him too much from the harsh weather of the world, leaving him susceptible to the first damp influence that came along. Monica was the fungus, yes, but Julian was the wood that had allowed her to take root. To save the house, to save the family, I had to be willing to cut deep. I had to be willing to hurt him to save him. I dressed carefully the next morning. I didn't wear a suit, I am not a lawyer. I wore my Sunday best, dark wool trousers, a white Oxford shirt, a tweed vest, and my polished leather boots. I looked like what I was, a craftsman who respected his work and expected others to do the same. I placed the red ledger in my leather satchel. Next to it, I placed the silver flash drive Lily had given me. "Are you ready?" I asked Lily. She was wearing a blazer she had borrowed from Eleanor's old wardrobe, oversized but dignified. She looked like a young attorney in training. "I'm scared," she admitted, hugging her backpack. "Dad is going to hate me." "Your father is going to be hurt," I said, placing a hand on her shoulder. "But one day, he will realize that you were the one who pulled him out of the burning building while he was still arguing about the thermostat." Courage is rarely appreciated in the moment, Lily. It is appreciated in the aftermath. We walked from the barn to the manor in the gray morning light. The fog was lifting, revealing the towering Douglas firs that lined the driveway, trees that had stood watch over this land long before I was born and would stand long after I was gone. The gravel crunched under our boots, a sound of approach that felt inevitable. The manor loomed ahead, a masterpiece of arts and crafts architecture. I saw the tapered columns of the porch, the deep overhangs of the eaves, the intricate woodwork of the dormers. It was a house built to breathe, to settle into the landscape rather than dominate it. But as we got closer, I saw the signs of neglect. The gutters were overflowing with pine needles. The paint on the window trim was peeling in spots I had meant to touch up before the chaos began. And there, parked aggressively on the front lawn, crushing the hydrangeas I had planted for Eleanor, was the white Range Rover. I unlocked the front door with my master key. The lock tumbled smoothly, my own work. We stepped into the foyer. The house smelled stale, a mix of old coffee, stress, and the cloying scent of that chemical lavender spray Monica used to mask the smell of damp. The heat was still off, and the air held a chill that seeped into the bones. There in the dining room, Lily whispered, checking her phone. "Mom is rehearsing her speech." I walked down the hallway, my footsteps heavy and deliberate on the quarter-sawn oak floors. I didn't sneak. I didn't hesitate. I walked with the ownership of a man who knows every nail in the floorboards. We entered the dining room. Marcus Thorne was already there, sitting at the far end of the table, his briefcase open, looking like a judge presiding over a silent court. Julian sat on the left, his head in his hands, wearing a sweater that looked like he had slept in it. Monica sat on the right. She was dressed for battle in a sharp white power suit, her hair perfectly blown out, her makeup flawless. But when she saw me, her eyes darted to the satchel in my hand, and for a split second, the mask slipped. "You're late," she snapped, checking her watch. "We don't have all day, Arthur. I have contractors coming at noon." "No," I said, pulling out the chair at the head of the table, my chair. I didn't sit. I stood behind it, resting my hands on the wood, looking down at the people who had tried to erase me. "You have demolition crews coming at noon. There is a difference." "Sit down, Dad," Julian mumbled, not looking up. "Let's just get this over with. Monica says if you sign the quitclaim, we can work out a monthly stipend for you. You won't be destitute." "A stipend," I repeated, tasting the word. "How generous." "It's more than you deserve after abandoning us," Monica hissed. "But I'm willing to be the bigger person. Sign the papers, Arthur. Give us the deed. Go live in your little barn and let us finally fix this money pit." I looked at Marcus Thorne. He gave me a barely perceptible nod. "I am not here to sign a quitclaim, Monica," I said, my voice dropping to that low, resonant register I used when explaining a complex structural failure to a client. "And I am not here to negotiate a stipend from my own assets." I reached into the satchel and pulled out the red ledger. I placed it on the table with a heavy thud. The sound echoed in the cold room, louder than a shout. "I am here to conduct a structural audit," I said. "And I'm afraid the foundation of this family has been condemned." The silence in the dining room was absolute, amplified by the relentless drumming of the rain against the windows. The red ledger sat on the polished mahogany table between us, a leather-bound brick of evidence that seemed to pulsate with the weight of unsaid truths. Monica looked at it with a mixture of disdain and unease, like a diner finding a fly in her soup, while Julian stared at the crimson cover as if he recognized it from a nightmare. "What is this?" Monica finally asked, her voice tight, trying to maintain the illusion of control. "Is this your diary, Arthur? Are we going to read about your feelings?" She let out a sharp, brittle laugh that fooled no one. "I don't have time for nostalgia." "This isn't a diary, Monica," I said, resting my hand on the cover. "It is a ledger. Specifically, it is a forensic accounting of the last 3 years of my finances, cross-referenced with your spending, your travel, and your history. My late wife, Eleanor, compiled the first half. I compiled the second. I opened the book to the marked page, the paper crackling in the quiet room. You claimed you wanted to sell the house because it was a money pit. But according to these records, the only thing draining money from this estate was you. Marcus Thorne took over, his voice clinical and devastating. We have documented transfers totaling $340,000 over 36 months, he said, sliding a spreadsheet across the table toward Julian. Funds allocated for roof repairs that were never performed. Invoices for antique restoration paid to shell companies registered in Henderson, Nevada. Withdrawals from the Emergency Medical Fund, Arthur's medical fund, used to purchase luxury goods in Milan and Paris. Thorne paused, letting the numbers sink in. This is embezzlement, Mrs. Blackwood. It is a felony. And in the state of Washington, when the victim is over 65, it carries a mandatory sentence enhancement. Julian picked up the spreadsheet. His hands were shaking so badly the paper rattled. He looked at the columns of numbers, his eyes widening as he recognized the dates, the amounts, the lies he had swallowed whole. Monica, he whispered, his voice cracking. The roof, you said the contractors needed cash up front. You said the leak was fixed. It is fixed. Monica snapped, though she refused to look at the paper. I handled it. I managed this house while your father sat in his workshop playing with wood. I deserve to be compensated for my labor. Labor, I repeated, turning the page to the section Eleanor had titled The Origin. Is that what you call it? I call it a long con. I pulled out the photograph of a younger Monica standing next to a blackjack table in Las Vegas, her arm draped around an elderly man who looked confused but happy. Julian, meet Carla Venn. She isn't from Connecticut. She isn't an interior designer. She is a professional predator who was investigated in 2015 for defrauding a retired professor in Arizona. Monica, Carla, went pale, the color draining from her face as if I had pulled a plug. She stared at the photograph, her mouth opening and closing without sound. The carefully constructed backstory of the St. James Terrace, the finishing school education, the philanthropic parents, it all dissolved in the face of a single grainy image. This is fake, she whispered, but the venom was gone from her voice, replaced by pure terror. You photoshopped this. You crazy old man, you made this up to ruin me. We didn't make up the audio, Lily said. It was the first time she had spoken. She stood up, her small frame trembling but her eyes fierce behind her glasses. She placed her laptop on the table and pressed a single key. Eleanor's voice filled the room. It was faint, breathless, recorded in the final weeks of her life when the oxygen tank was her constant companion, but the clarity of her mind was unmistakable. I know what she is, Arthur, Eleanor's voice said, echoing off the walls she had loved. I heard her on the phone with her mother. She called the house a museum of dusty junk. She said she was just waiting for the bold witch to die so she could start the liquidation. She hates us, Arthur. She hates Julian. She only loves the numbers. Julian made a sound like a wounded animal. He covered his face with his hands, his shoulders heaving. To hear his mother's voice, confirming his worst fears from beyond the grave, was a blow that shattered whatever denial he had left. Monica sat frozen, her eyes wide, realizing that the bold witch she had dismissed had been recording her victory lap before the race was even won. She was hallucinating, Monica stammered, desperation making her voice shrill. She was on morphine, Julian. You know how she got at the end. She was paranoid. Was she? I asked. Then explain this. I nodded to Lily. She opened the folder of text messages, the ones she had intercepted from the cloud. She projected them onto the laptop screen, the green bubbles glowing like toxic waste. Viper, truck is ready. Crew is on standby. Monica, good. The old timberhead is finally out. I need the house gutted by Friday. Start with the silver and the library. I want everything of value in the truck before Julian realizes what's happening. Viper, and the husband? Monica, he's a non-factor. He'll do what he's told. Just get the cash ready. I want to be in Cabo by the 20th. The silence that followed was heavy, suffocating. Julian stared at the screen, reading the words over and over. He's a non-factor. Gutted by Friday. He looked at his wife, really looked at her, for the first time in years. He didn't see the glamour or the confidence anymore. He saw the termite that had hollowed him out. You weren't selling the house, Julian said, his voice barely a whisper. You were going to rob us. You were going to strip it bare. I was doing it for us. Monica screamed, standing up and knocking her chair over. For our future. This house is a millstone, Julian. It's a rotting pile of lumber that ties us to this miserable, rainy coast. I was going to set us free. We could have had millions. We could have had a life. A life built on theft is not a life, Monica, I said quietly. It is a crime scene. I closed the red ledger. Here is the situation. Marcus has already drafted a criminal complaint. We have evidence of embezzlement, elder abuse, fraud, and conspiracy to commit theft. The texts to Viper, a known fence in Las Vegas, by the way, are enough to secure a warrant for your arrest today. Monica looked at the door, then at the window, searching for an escape route that didn't exist. She was trapped in the dining room she had wanted to renovate, surrounded by the people she had tried to erase. However, I continued, I am a builder, not an executioner. I have no desire to see the mother of my granddaughter in prison, regardless of how much she deserves it. So, I am offering you a choice. Option A, we call the police. They are currently parked at the bottom of the driveway, waiting for a signal from Mr. Thorne. You will be arrested, charged, and likely sentenced to 5 to 7 years. I slid a single document across the table. Option B, you sign this. It is a full confession and a relinquishment of all claims to the Blackwood estate, assets, and custody of Lily, who is legal age in 6 months anyway but needs protection now. You will leave this house today. You will take only what you brought into the marriage, your clothes and your car. You will leave the state of Washington and never contact any of us again. If you do, the criminal complaint will be filed immediately. Monica looked at the paper, then at Julian. Mike. Julian, please. Are you going to let him do this to me? I'm your wife. Julian stood up. He looked older than his 40 years, worn down by the friction of loving a woman who couldn't love him back. He walked over to the window and looked out at the rain. My wife wanted to build a life with me, he said, his voice flat. You wanted to liquidate me. He turned back to her, his eyes cold. Sign the paper, Carla. And get out of my father's house. Monica stared at him, stunned by the sudden steel in his spine. She looked at me, at Lily, at the red ledger that had documented her downfall. She realized, finally, that the game was over. She snatched the pen from the table and scribbled her signature, tearing the paper in her haste. You're all pathetic, she spat, grabbing her purse. "You deserve this miserable, drafty mausoleum. I hope you rot in it." "We won't rot," I said calmly as she stormed toward the door. "We know how to treat the wood." She slammed the front door so hard the stained glass rattled, but it held. I had reinforced the frame myself. We stood in the silence of the aftermath, the tension slowly bleeding out of the room. The demolition was complete. Now, the cleanup could begin. The sound of the pen scratching against the paper was the only noise in the room, a dry, friction-filled sound like a chisel slipping on stone. Monica signed her name, not with the flourish she used for her fans, but with a jagged, angry scrawl that tore through the fiber of the page. She was signing away a fortune she had never earned, a house she had never loved, and a family she had viewed only as a resource to be mined. When she finished, she threw the pen down. It skittered across the mahogany table and fell onto the floor, rolling until it hit Julian's shoe. He didn't move. He didn't look at it. He was looking at the woman he had married, and for the first time, he was seeing the empty space where her soul should have been. There, she spat, her voice trembling with a toxic cocktail of humiliation and rage. "You have your precious paper. You have your moldy, drafty house. I hope you choke on the dust." She grabbed her purse, the knuckles of her hand white against the leather. "I'm leaving. But don't think for a second that this is over. I'll write a book. I'll go on every podcast that will have me. I will tell the world how the great Arthur Blackwood abused a helpless woman and turned his son against her." "You can tell them whatever you like," I said, sliding the document into my satchel next to the red ledger. "But remember, Monica, we have the recordings. And unlike your stories, the truth doesn't need a filter to be compelling." She turned to Julian then, her eyes narrowing into slits. This was the moment I had feared for him, the final lash of the whip before the master leaves the plantation. "And you," she hissed, leaning in close enough that he could smell the fear beneath her perfume. "You are pathetic. You were pathetic when I met you, and you're pathetic now. You'll never be a man like your father. You're just a shadow. A weak, spineless shadow that I had to prop up for 5 years." Julian slowly lifted his head. His eyes were red-rimmed, hollowed out by grief, but there was a flicker of something new in them, a quiet, dangerous resolve. "You didn't prop me up, Carla," he said softly, using her real name like a curse. "You hollowed me out. You isolated me from my parents. You made me feel small so you could feel big. But you forgot one thing." "Oh," she sneered. "And what's that?" "I'm a Blackwood," he said. "We don't break. We just rebuild." The slap echoed through the room like a gunshot. It was fast, vicious, and aimed to hurt. Julian's head snapped to the side, a red mark blooming instantly on his cheek. Lily gasped, stepping forward, but I held up a hand to stop her. This was between them. Julian didn't flinch. He didn't raise his hand to strike back. He simply turned his face back to her, looking at her with a profound, terrifying pity. "Get out," he said. Monica let out a scream of pure frustration, a primal sound of a predator denied its kill. She looked around the room for something to destroy, something to hurt us with. Her eyes landed on a vase sitting on the sidebar, a blue and white porcelain piece that Eleanor had bought in San Francisco on our honeymoon. It was irreplaceable. She lunged for it, grabbing it by the neck. "I hate this house," she shrieked, winding up to throw it against the stone fireplace. I moved then. Not with the speed of a young man, but with the anticipation of a craftsman who knows exactly where the stress fracture will occur. I stepped between her and the fireplace, not to catch the vase, but to block her path. She froze, the porcelain heavy in her hand, breathing hard. "Throw it," I said calmly. "Break it. It's just a thing, Monica. It's fired clay and glaze. You can shatter every plate in this house, you can burn the curtains, you can scratch the floors. But you cannot break what holds this family together. You tried for 5 years, and you failed." She stared at me, her chest heaving, the vase trembling in her grip. For a moment, I thought she would throw it at me. But then, the energy seemed to drain out of her. She realized that violence would not give her the satisfaction she craved because we were no longer afraid of her. She lowered the vase, setting it down on the table with a heavy thud that cracked the delicate base. It was a final, petty act of vandalism, but it was the best she could do. "You deserve each other," she muttered. She turned and stormed out of the dining room, her heels clicking sharply on the hardwood, a staccato rhythm of retreat. We heard the front door slam, a sound that shook the window panes. Then came the roar of the Range Rover's engine, the crunch of gravel as she peeled out of the driveway, and finally, the fading hum of tires on wet pavement. Then, silence. It was a profound silence, deeper than the quiet of the barn. It was the silence of a battlefield after the artillery has stopped. The rain continued to fall outside, but inside, the air felt different. Lighter. The pressure that had been building for years, the constant low-level anxiety of walking on eggshells, had evaporated. Marcus Thorne closed his briefcase. The click of the latches was loud in the room. "I will file these immediately," he said, standing up. "The restraining order will be active by this afternoon. If she returns to the property, call 911. Do not engage." He looked at Julian, then at me. "You have a lot of work to do, Arthur. But the demolition is finished." I walked him to the door, shaking his hand with a grip that conveyed more gratitude than words could. When I returned to the dining room, Lily was sitting next to her father. She hadn't hugged him yet, she was just sitting there, offering her presence as a silent support. Julian was staring at the table, at the cracked vase, at the empty space where his wife had been. He looked shattered. "I didn't know," he whispered, his voice thick with tears. "Dad, I swear. I didn't know about the money. I didn't know about the texts." "I know," I said, walking over to the fireplace. I knelt down and began to arrange the kindling, dry cedar strips I had brought from the workshop. Deception is like dry rot, Julian. It hides behind the paint. You only see it when you push a screwdriver through the wall and it crumbles. "I let her treat you like garbage," he said, the tears finally spilling over. "I let her push you out of your own home." I stood there and watched. "How can you even look at me?" I struck a match. The flame flared bright and hot, smelling of sulfur. I touched it to the cedar, watching the fire catch, small at first, then growing as it found the fuel. "I look at you and I see my son," I said. "I see a man who was manipulated by a professional. I see a man who forgot his foundation for a while but found it again when it mattered." I stood up and dusted the ash from my hands. I walked over to the table and placed a hand on his shoulder. It was heavy, warm, and real. "We don't build on regret, Julian. It's poor material. It shifts. It crumbles. We build on what is left. And look around you." I gestured to Lily, to the sturdy walls of the manor, to the fire crackling in the hearth. The structure is still standing. Julian looked up at me, his face ravaged by grief and shame, but his eyes were clear. He reached up and covered my hand with his own, squeezing tight. "I'm so sorry, Dad." "I know," I said. "Now, stand up. We have to change the locks." We spent the rest of the afternoon in a kind of functional trance. I retrieved my tool bag from the truck. Julian, grateful for a task that required his hands rather than his heart, helped me remove the lock cores from every door in the house. We worked in tandem, unscrewing faceplates, swapping out cylinders, rekeying the perimeter. It was a ritual of reclaiming. With every turn of the screwdriver, we were stripping away Monica's access, her control, her ability to hurt us. Lily sat at the kitchen table, monitoring the bank accounts as the transfers began to reverse. She tried to use the joint card at a gas station 10 minutes ago, she called out. "Denied." "Good," Julian said, tightening a screw on the back door. "Let her walk." By evening, the house was secure. The locks were new. The codes were changed. The digital footprint of Carla Venn had been scrubbed from the network. We sat in the living room, the three of us, in front of the fire I had built. It was the first time in 3 years that we had sat in this room without the television blaring reality shows, without Monica critiquing the furniture arrangement, without the tension that used to suck the oxygen out of the air. I looked at my son, staring into the flames. I looked at my granddaughter, her laptop finally closed. And I looked at the empty chair where Eleanor used to sit. She was gone, but she was here. She had provided the blueprint for this victory, the red ledger that had saved us. "What do we do now?" Lily asked, breaking the silence. "The house feels big." "It is big," I agreed. "It was built for a family." Julian looked at me. "I don't know if I can stay here, Dad. Everywhere I look, I see her. I see the changes she made. The paint. The gravel patio. It all feels contaminated." "Then we fix it," I said simply. "We strip the paint. We tear up the gravel. We replant the roses. We restore it, Julian. That's what we do. We take what is broken and we make it whole again." I stood up and walked to the mantel, where a picture of Eleanor sat. I touched the frame. "But first," I said, "I think we should order a pizza. A large one. With everything on it. And we are going to eat it right out of the box, in the living room, on the coffee table." Julian looked at me, a slow, hesitant smile spreading across his face, the first real smile I had seen in years. "Monica would kill us. She said grease ruins the feng shui." "Monica," I said, poking the fire with the iron poker, "doesn't live here anymore. 6 months can change the character of a house, just as it can change the character of a man." The Seattle rain had returned, as it always does, but the dampness no longer felt like an intrusion. It felt like a cleansing. I stood in the center of the dining room, the smell of chemical stripper and raw oak heavy in the air. We had spent the last 8 weekends here, Julian and I, painstakingly removing the layers of grayish paint that Monica had slapped over the mahogany wainscoting. It was slow, tedious work. You cannot rush the removal of a mistake without damaging the grain beneath. You have to apply the solvent, wait for it to bubble, and then scrape it away, inch by inch, until the honest wood is revealed again. Julian was on his knees in a corner, working a scraper along the baseboard. He had lost weight since the divorce was finalized, shedding the softness of a man who lived on takeout and false promises. His hands, once smooth and nervous, were now stained with walnut stain and calloused from the sandpaper. He didn't talk much these days, but when he did, his voice had a timbre to it that hadn't been there before. He wasn't asking for permission to exist anymore. He was simply existing. "I think I found the original finish," he said, sitting back on his heels and wiping his forehead. He pointed to a patch of wood that glowed with a deep, reddish warmth. It was buried under 3 coats of latex. "Latex seals the moisture in," I said, walking over to inspect his work. "It rots the wood from the inside because it can't breathe." Monica wanted everything sealed, smooth, and uniform. She didn't understand that a house needs to breathe. Julian looked up at me. "I'm sorry it took so long to scrape it off, Dad." "The important thing is that we found the wood underneath," I replied. "It's still sound. It just needed to see the light." We worked until the light faded, the rhythm of our labor replacing the awkward silence that had defined our relationship for so long. Lily joined us for dinner, bringing in a tray of sandwiches. She had been accepted into the engineering program at the University of Washington, her tuition fully covered by the trust Eleanor had set up years ago, a trust Monica had never found because she was looking for cash, not investments. Lily walked through the house with a lightness now, her laughter echoing in the hallways that used to be hushed by fear. She sat on the floor, sketching on her tablet, designing a new gazebo for the garden to replace the gravel pit Monica had installed. "Mon called me today," Lily said quietly, not looking up from her screen. The room went still. Julian froze, his sandwich halfway to his mouth. What did she want? "She wanted money," Lily said, her voice devoid of emotion. "She's in Arizona. She said she's working on a new venture and needed a bridge loan. She said she misses me." Lily paused, then erased a line on her drawing. I blocked the number. Julian let out a long breath, shoulders sagging with relief. "Good. She's not coming back," I said, looking at the fire crackling in the hearth. "Marcus Thorne sent me the file yesterday. She's currently facing indictment in Nevada. It seems that a Viper text messages opened a lot of doors for the FBI. She won't be flipping houses where she's going. She'll be making license plates." We didn't celebrate the news. There is no joy in watching the mother of your grandchild self-destruct. There is only the grim satisfaction of knowing that the threat has been neutralized. Monica, Carla, was a storm that had passed. We were the coastline that had survived the surge. We had lost some trees, yes. The landscape was altered. But the bedrock remained. Later that night, after Julian had gone to his room, the guest room, as he refused to sleep in the master suite until we had completely remodeled it, I sat alone in the library. The red ledger sat on the desk. I hadn't opened it in months. It had served its purpose. It had been the shield and the sword, the weapon Eleanor had forged to protect us when she could no longer stand guard herself. But now, its weight felt different. It felt like an artifact of a war that was over. I picked up the book and walked to the fireplace. The flames were dying down, glowing embers pulsating in the dark. I held the ledger for a long moment, thinking about the woman who had written it. Eleanor hadn't kept these records out of hate. She had kept them out of love. She had documented the ugly truth so that we could one day return to something beautiful. "Thank you, my love," I whispered into the silence. "We're safe now." I placed the red ledger onto the embers. The leather cover curled and blackened, the pages catching fire one by one. I watched as the numbers, the dates, the evidence of betrayal turned to ash and floated up the chimney. We didn't need a record of the dead anymore. The balance had been paid. I walked out onto the back porch. The rain had stopped, and the clouds were breaking, revealing a sliver of moon over the Puget Sound. The air smelled of wet earth and pine needles, the scent of the Pacific Northwest, the scent of home. I looked out at the dark outline of the barn, my sanctuary, and then back at the manor, my legacy. Julian was right. It was a big house. Too big for 3 people, perhaps. But it wasn't just a house. It was a vessel. It carried our history, our mistakes, and our redemption. It was built of stout timber and honest stone, and though it had been infested, it had not fallen. I am 74 years old. My hands are scarred, my joints ache when it rains, and I miss my wife every single day. But as I stood there in the quiet of the night, listening to the owl call from the Douglas fir, I realized that I was not finished. There were floors to refinish. There were roses to replant. There was a son to teach and a granddaughter to cheer for. I am Arthur Blackwood. I am a builder. And tomorrow, I have work to do. This story asks us to consider the foundations we build our lives upon. Monica believed that value was something you could fake with a coat of paint and a filter. She thought that dignity was a weakness and that silence was submission. She learned, too late, that the strongest structures are often the quietest, and that true power doesn't come from taking, it comes from building. We often underestimate the elderly in our society. We see the gray hair and the slower steps, and we assume they are past their prime, ready to be pushed aside. But we forget that those hands built the world we live in. We forget that wisdom is not just a passive trait, it is a tactical advantage. Arthur didn't win because he was louder. He won because he was patient. He won because he knew that truth, like water, eventually finds its way through every crack in a lie. Have you ever been underestimated? Have you ever had to stand your ground against someone who mistook your kindness for weakness? Or perhaps you have a guardian ghost in your own life, someone who protected you in ways you didn't understand until later. I would love to hear your stories. Share them in the comments below. Your experience might be the blueprint someone else needs to rebuild their own life. If this story moved you, if you believe in the power of quiet justice and the resilience of family, please share it with someone who needs to hear it. Sometimes, just knowing that the good guys can win is enough to keep someone fighting. Thank you for listening. Thank you for staying until the end. And remember, some people look at a house and see a dollar sign. Others see a home. Be the one who knows the difference.